Ladies, gentlemen, and friends from beyond the binary, if you've been here before, welcome back. If not, then welcome. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about subcultures, commodification, and aesthetics, particularly with respect to the punk and goth subcultures. To do so, we're going to go over some sociological and philosophical theory for the first part of the video, then we're going to do a specific dive into the history of punk and goth, and then I'm going to tie it back into my own experience trying to express myself in an authentic way, and the conflicts I've run into in doing so. Before we get into things, a bit of a disclaimer: though I've read as much as I can of the philosophy I'm going to be discussing, I am by no means an expert on this philosophy, and if this philosophy does interest you, I would recommend seeking out other sources beyond just me informing your ideas. With that being said, let's get into things. Part 1. Karl Marx, Alienation, Reification, and Commodity Fetishism. If we're talking about commodification in this video, we're going to have to touch on some of the foundational theory laid by Big Daddy Communism himself, Karl Marx. Marx spoke about the concept of alienation extensively. In the context of his work, it referred to the disconnect between a worker and their work in the course of selling their labour to a capitalist. He mentioned 4 different forms that this alienation took. The first and second being that they are alienated from what they produce and the act of producing it, because they don't have control over the production process, and also because they don't receive compensation equal to the value of the work they do. The third facet he described was alienation from one's Gattungswesen, or one's species essence, or humanity would be the best translation. And finally, he talked about the alienation that workers experience from each other. After all, the labour of a worker is viewed as a commodity, and the labour of another worker who is in the same industry is viewed as a like commodity, and like commodities in capitalist markets compete with one another. Therefore, you have an inherent antagonism between the different members of the working class. Reification is a special type of alienation, defined by Petrovic as the act or result of the act of transforming human properties, relations, and actions into properties, relations, and actions of man-produced things, which have become independent and which are imagined as originally independent of man and govern his life. Also, transformation of human beings into thing-like beings which do not behave in a human way, but according to the laws of the thing world. Reification is a special case of alienation, its most radical and widespread form characteristic of modern capitalist society. Now, let's set aside that Petrovic used the term he and the term man to refer to all humans. Let's put that aside for the time being. What does he actually mean when he says this? How do we put this in terminology that's easy to understand? Well, reification is the result of some kinds of alienation, referring to non-living objects being imbued with lifelike attributes by those perceiving them, such as consumers. The producer, for instance, is alienated from their creation. Let's use a table as an example. But the consumer comes to see the value the worker added to the table as intrinsic to the table itself. For all the consumer sees, the table has the intrinsic property of being a table, as opposed to having the intrinsic property of being wooden, and the added property of someone having added labour to it to give it a certain form. Finally, we have the concept of commodity fetishism. The term fetish here is borrowed from its use in anthropology, its less fun use, where it refers to a sacred or symbolic object imbued with some form of inexplicable power. Definitions here often use the term supernatural. I would prefer the term inexplicable, as Marx himself was very secular, very against the idea of religion, so it would rub me the wrong way to use the term supernatural in explaining his theory. Marx argued that commodities become fetishes because the reason that their price point was arrived at is unclear, and this is the inexplicable part of their nature. I mean, price points aren't decided upon by rarity, for instance, because there's plenty of things just as rare as diamonds that don't fetch the same price. It's definitely not tied to their actual utility on the face of it, because you can't eat a diamond, and yet it's worth way more than a loaf of bread. So how was the price point arrived at? Well, it's not really explainable. An economist might seek to explain this by saying the market decides, but the market is a manifestation of this kind of vaguely culturally agreed upon price point for an item. So you're just kind of restating the same conundrum. Hey guys, just doing a cutaway to the editing bay to provide an example real quick. It would be like someone pointing at Google's algorithms and saying, these things are so complex and so opaque that not even Google's own workers understand them. And someone has a rebuttal to that where they say, no, they understand them. They just use neural networks. Okay, everyone understands that they use neural networks, but no one understands how those neural networks actually work. You haven't explained the ambiguity present. You haven't explained this inexplicable property. So, congratulations, you kind of just restated the issue without solving it. But that's about it. Back to your regularly scheduled programming with the version of me that is far more put together and has a bed actually made in the background. Another part of this commodity fetishism is tied to reification, the fact that the consumer does not perceive the labor that was placed into the wood, for instance, that was then turned into a table. They merely see it in its full table form, and it has, and for all intents and purposes always had, the intrinsic property of table. The means through which it arrived at having the property table are unclear. Obviously it is clear, we know that labor was put into it, but we just don't think about it in our day-to-day consumer relations. Part 2, the Situationist International, Spectacle and Recuperation. Also known as, I'm sorry, there's a bit more theory. So Marx's ideas of alienation, reification, and commodity fetishism are all intrinsically linked and interconnected with one another. However, as the decades rolled on, times changed, and a group of new scholars called the Situationist International attempted to iterate on these theories and modernize them for their particular era. Specifically, their literature coalesced into a criticism of society's fascination with the so-called spectacle in the era of post-World War consumer capitalism. This concept was introduced by Guy Debord in his book The Society of the Spectacle, but what does spectacle mean here? Well, its origins as a word trace to, as one would imagine, something being spectacular, some great public display, and that is where the through line into the academic definition of the term spectacle begins. Debord essentially believed that the reification of commodities, the assignment of life to that which is unliving, caused people to become observers of the commodities in a way. Commodities in their reified, personalized state make up the spectacle. The freedom for one to choose what to do becomes replaced with the freedom for one to choose what to buy. You are still free to make all of your decisions, but know that all of your decisions will be filtered through the lens of capital. In this way, participants in the society become subservient to capital and become wrapped up in this kind of collective social hallucination of how things are. I imagine that Mark Fisher's book Capitalist Realism has some pretty strong through lines into the Situationist International's philosophy, which I'm looking forward to diving into once I get around to reading that book, but I digress. It might be a bit hard to wrap your head around precisely what all of this means. I definitely found it pretty challenging myself, but the part I'm going to be focusing on most is this next part. How does the spectacle handle dissident, radical elements? Those who seek to criticize the dominant culture, those who seek to criticize capitalism, how are they viewed by the spectacle? How does the spectacle manage them and kind of make it so that they don't cause too much of a fuss? Well, Debord's answer was that it simply repackaged these ideas. It sanitized them, removed their fangs, and repackaged them as an aesthetic of counterculture that can just exist within the culture itself. Debord termed this process récupération, or recuperation in English, or possibly a better translation might be co-optation. And there is no place where this co-optation is more visible than in punk. Part 3. Punk. Initially a staple of counterculture, anti-capitalism, and rebellion against the injustices in the status quo, punk has become subsumed by the spectacle and the market. It has been devoured by the cultural and economic zeitgeist, becoming the very thing which it swore to destroy. As oh so many fast fashion products will tell you, punk is dead, long live punk. And oh the irony to buy a piece of fast fashion with such a slogan on it. Perhaps a more fitting twisted quote would be punk is dead and this shirt has killed it. Punk embodied an aggressive sort of individualism and a distaste for the status quo and popular culture. It led to the aesthetic of many punks being defined in opposition to standards of social acceptability. It was loud, it was brash, and it was an attention-grabbing declaration of one's own individuality. Also a declaration that one holds their sense of individuality so close that they refuse to trade it in for a sense of belonging. After all, if I have to trade in my sense of self for my sense of belonging, well, no one actually thinks I belong, do they? As such, the unacceptability, the transgressive nature of punk, the fact that it elicited disapproval in so many, was part of the entire point. Now, punk is less transgressive, or at least punkish ways of presenting oneself are considered less transgressive today, at least in the spaces that I'm exposed to, which does actually warp the punk culture somewhat. I mean, after all, if it's defined in opposition to societal acceptance, and yet it is societally accepted, that's gotta warp things somewhat, right? That doesn't mean that punks can't be individual anymore. One can be accepted by a society and still express their individuality. Those aren't at all mutually exclusive conditions. So let's have a look at the other values of punk and see how other values are ticking along then, shall we? A DIY ethos, anti-capitalism, and anti-consumerism are three of the other pillars of punk. Not only have we fallen at the first hurdle, we have fallen well and truly before the first hurdle. We have fallen so badly that our ripped jeans offered us no protection from scraping our knees up. Pithiness aside, these values all informed punk originally, both out of a sense of necessity in some cases, a sense of morality in others, and a sense of both in others still. Punk came from a very working class background where people couldn't necessarily afford new clothes all the time. Thus, obviously people are going to try and get the maximum mileage possible out of their clothing. Plus, it was an anti-capitalist movement. They wanted to support capitalism as little as possible. Ergo, they would try to not buy more shit. Makes sense. As such, you ended up with torn, taped, stitched together, worn, repaired, worn again, repaired again clothing becoming a mainstay within the culture. Nowadays, it's more common for you to buy the clothing pre-torn, which kinda defeats the entire purpose, right? I mean, this came out of a pragmatic decision to save money and a morals-driven decision to essentially withdraw one's support for capitalism. And what, people now show their desire to withdraw support for capitalism by buying shit? That doesn't quite track, does it? What was once a decision made around values and an associated ethics system, and also necessity, became cultural, and those who sought to embody that culture without embodying the associated values system sought to co-opt it, and they did. This process of recuperation and sanitization by those outside the movement is incredibly frustrating. It's elegant, but it's incredibly frustrating. And punks weren't very happy about it. Is it any wonder that so many turned to gatekeeping? Part 3b, in Defence of Gatekeeping. Those of you who watched my video on marketing may recall a particular metaphor I used in outlining how marketing violates one's right to self-determination and self-governance. I likened the human mind to a city, and likened the insidious voices injected into your head by marketing as spies, sent to infiltrate the city and influence your governance for the ends of some external party. I would contend that a similar metaphor can be extended here, on a more macro level. Just as marketing sought to commodify individual minds, the collective minds making up a subculture can be manipulated by capitalism and this notion of the spectacle, commodification, other such concepts. The underlying principle of capitalism is this notion that people will act in accordance with their own self-interest. Now, for various reasons, this is not how a lot of people behave, but for those at the top of capitalism and in market-based systems, it is. So, what then is the self-interest of capitalists? Well, the self-interest of a capitalist would involve the commodification of whatever they can get their hands on, and the extraction of value on it. After all, they need to extract value from something to get value. The rest is completely cast aside. You're acting in self-interest, remember, not altruistically. Just as a colonial power seeks to enlarge their empire through conquest, so too do capitalists and capitalism seek to expand their empires of capital through an ideology of endless expansion. One could imagine different cultures, subcultures, and ways of life being different population centers in the way of this expansion. Vassal states in the making, as capitalism might call them. Is it any surprise that upon the arrival of this exploitative force trying to suck out all of the surplus value from this community, is there any surprise that when such a force arrives, they are told to fuck off? Are the people who tell that force to fuck off outside of their rights? Are they outside of their lane? No. They are protecting what is theirs. They are not allowing themselves to be exploited. If colonial Britain was to try and expand to have another colony, would you blame the colony for standing against their own exploitation? Some would. I would hope you wouldn't. Right, let's get into something a little bit less controversial than defending gatekeeping. Part 4. Goth. So, Goth is one of the post-punk subcultures, and it was defined in an interview with a Goth musician, Aurelio Voltaire, as the melancholy cousin of punk, where punk said, quote, "I don't like this world, it makes me angry." Goth said, quote, "There is a lot of evil in this world, and that makes me very sad." Goth is a massive, sprawling subculture with several facets and different sub-subcultures, but there are undercurrents that underlie all of the different facets of the subculture. Specifically, a fascination with the taboo. Even more specifically, death and sexual expression are common in almost all Gothic circles. Taking a mostly accepting stance on, and often taking stylistic inspiration from, things like kink, drag, some forms of queer expression, and more forms of sexuality that were viewed as transgressive by the mainstream, Goth positioned itself as a very accepting, inclusive space, a space where people could exist as their authentic selves without shame. Goth's acceptance of and affinity for the darker sides of life and the darker sides of human experience and emotion also played a part in this. The acceptance of concepts like mortality, death, existential fears, anger, angst, distress, depression, allowed for a space where people didn't have to pretend that they were okay. But this facet of Goth, its accepting nature, the fact that it was open to people being mentally distressed, was a factor in many of its criticisms, as well as many of its defences. A common theme among critics of the goth subculture was this idea that poor mental health isn't just accepted by goths, it's romanticised by them, and thus it causes poor mental health outcomes. Now, it's important to bear in mind that a lot of the criticism surrounding the goth subculture came from moral panics, such as that left in the wake of the Columbine High School massacre in 1999, and a lot of studies, even peer-reviewed ones from that time, do not really read like thoughtful forays into sociological theories and possible notions of how we could help people. They read more like hit pieces and propaganda directed against goths, oftentimes drawing conclusions that are completely divorced from the actual evidence that they're trying to draw upon. I've put the DOI code for one such study in the description if you really want to have a look, but it is not available for free legally online, so whatever. Considering the pile of garbage studies, quite frankly, I had to wade through in creating this section, I'm gonna indulge myself here a little, and I'm gonna go into detail on a couple of them. I'll be quick and I'll only go into the ones that were salvageable, shall we say, because some of these did actually attempt to find out why goths were doing so poorly in terms of mental health. These studies were obviously imperfect. I mean, all science is imperfect, but also, as a social science, you can't really conduct a fully controlled experiment. As such, you're limited to correlational studies. Sure, you can look at multiple variables and you can try and control for different variables that might get in the way, but you still have to take conclusions that draw a causal inference, that is, they say X causes Y, with a pretty hefty handful of salt. One thing that we do know is that goths are more likely to have worse mental health, bleaker outlooks, and more trauma than the average person, even before they begin to associate with the movement, or even before they begin to hear of the movement. And obviously, this is a very relevant factor, right? If people who have worse mental health are predisposed to seek goth out, of course mental health is going to be worse in that space. That doesn't mean goth caused it. And the literature is pretty consistent that this is a relevant factor. It conflicts on just how much of the relationship it explains, but it agrees that it's pretty relevant. Another factor that the literature commonly agrees on is the ostracism that goths face. Now, this can take the form of very explicit, very obviously wrong things, such as, literal assault, but can also take the form of more minor, seemingly completely innocuous offences, such as comparing someone's septum ring to the ring that they put through the nose of a bull, such as talking about ripped jeans as if they got pulled out of a dumpster. Now, you might think that's a harmless joke, but I can assure you that after I hear the same unfunny, unoriginal joke about something that is tied to my identity and that I derive pleasure from, when I hear the same terrible joke made about that thing for the 15th time, I get pretty pissy. In short, we know that the disposition of someone before they identify as a goth, combined with the ostracism they face after they start identifying as a goth, both play an important role in the poor mental health outcomes of goths, and similar trends can be observed across many other alternative subcultures. With that being said, there's no real conclusive evidence as to whether exposure to goth actually causes worse or better mental health, or has no effect on it. Quite frankly, that portion of the argument is always very, very difficult to isolate in all forms of sociological research. Now, was all of this academic speak necessary? Yes, it was. Not for your sake, but for mine, because if the pain and suffering I went through in reading some of these trashy studies wasn't visible in some way in this project, I would cry. Was it relevant, though? That's debatable, but let's just move on. Part 4b, the emergence of goth, also known as "this video is structured very badly." Goth originated from the evolution of punk rock into several different subgenres, specifically Gothic Rock. What set this subgenre apart was the more existential, brooding, macabre, melancholy tone of it. It also drew influences from subgenres such as glam rock, giving it a very poetic feel almost, sometimes even theatrical, as musicians like the previously mentioned Aurelio Voltaire really lean into. Bear in mind, I don't have anything in the way of formal qualification when it comes to music, and I'm not the most knowledgeable when it comes to it, so I might be reading into this too far, but if you listen to a song like Cities in Dust by Shosi and the Banshees, and you listen to the drums and the guitar, you can really hear the punk influence in it. I don't know exactly what it is, but you can hear it, and you can hear, even though it's got this punk influence, that it's tempered, it's mellowed out, it's melancholy. And the subject matter of the song is certainly melancholy also. I mean, the song is about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the burying of the city of Pompeii. It's about a natural disaster that caused the death of an entire city. Despite the macabre subject matter of the song, though, and despite the melancholy nature of the song, it's kind of a bop. Like, you could dance to it, for sure. It mentions the morbidity of its subject matter right before celebrating it. The song, metaphorically speaking, takes place in a graveyard, but also metaphorically speaking is dancing a jig atop one of the graves. Now, there are similar examples of very heavily conflicting ideas trying to be reconciled even within the modern hyper-capitalist music industry. But I would draw a distinction between how Goth did it and how these modern industries do it. I would specifically point to an example where I compare Cities in Dust, which I've just outlined, with a house remix of the song Zombie, originally by the Cranberries. In Cities in Dust, it felt like a very intentional decision to fuse something that could be enjoyed with something melancholy. The juxtaposition was part of the artistic merit of the piece. In this remix of Zombie, however, it felt more like a board of execs sat around and went, it will get 3 million listens if we don't include these samples that people will recognize, and it will get 5 million if we do include it. Therefore, we should include these samples. And I'm going to resist the urge to go on a rant against that song about how disrespectful commodifying a song about the fucking Troubles was. I'm going to not go on that rant. I've got "But I Digress" written in the script. I am not going to digress, and we will go on to the next part. Part 4C, Goth and its Evolution. The term Molgoth, with or without a space, originated in the late 90s. Similar to the term poser, it was an insult used to refer to someone adopting goth fashion purely for the aesthetic value, with no respect for the culture and music that informed the actual movement. Some traditional goths, or trad goths, viewed this as commercialization of the movement. Others viewed individual Molgoths with cynicism, but in both cases, whether a micro or macroscopic perspective was taken, there was an undercurrent of understanding that something was wrong here. Something was being cheapened. Something was being taken away. Surplus value was being extracted. And who would the surplus value be being extracted by but the capitalists? And what mechanism would they be using but the spectacle? I did have a section in here where I would congratulate myself if people successfully managed to arrive at this conclusion, and would insult people who didn't join the dots, but I feel like I did such a terrible job at explaining the theory in the early parts of the video that I cannot in good conscience make that joke. In any case, Molgoth started to influence and be influenced by other subcultural movements, particularly different subgenres of metal and emo. Now, the emo subculture was the one that goth resonated with most, and the one that it combined with most. As these different monochrome subcultures entwined, it became increasingly more difficult for those outside of those spaces to tell the difference. And just a brief little thing from the goth part of me, for the love of all that is unholy, band tees are not a staple of Gothic fashion. Don't get me wrong, they're a thing, they're a cool thing, they're a thing that people get a lot of value from, but they are from a movement that goth evolved out of, not from goth. Just, all I'm saying is please stop dead-naming subcultures. That's it. In any case though, Molgoth's progression from goth into something else is not inherently bad, Molgoth becoming a kind of reclaimed term by those who it was used as a pejorative against. I mean, an element of the goth subculture split off, and it fused with the emo subculture. These were both perfectly compatible subcultures with each other that made something really beautiful. And also, I mean, hey, they both came from punk at some point. So it's almost like a reunion of punk's children, you know? And for people who that works for, that's super cool. And not just, yeah, that's cool, in the way that, you know, a lot of people making that concession often phrase it. No, that's actually awesome! I'm so happy for the people that works for, and for the people who find a sense of community in that, and I have no qualms with them. The thing I have a qualm with is that this reunion of punk's children, this reunion of siblings, as is only befitting the children of punk, took place squatting in some abandoned old house. And then the authorities showed up and kicked everyone out. In this metaphor, being kicked out into the cold street being equivalent to being kicked out into the cold, calculating world of the market. The spectacle had identified another market segment that it could sell merchandise to, that it could sell ripped jeans to, that it could sell hair dye to, and was not interested in any of the surrounding context. Just interested in how it could market itself to this demographic. Part 5. A few closing thoughts and the personal side of this video. So, what motivated me to make this video? Was it my passive observation of the recuperation and sabotage of subcultures around me, committed by the spectacle, leading me to some idea that it's my moral obligation to call it out to whoever I can? Of course not. My motivation to make this video came in response to getting particular feedback about my own appearance. How X, Y, or Z would look aesthetically, quote-unquote, better. Or how colours A, B, and C suit me, whereas colours D, E, and F do not, etc. Because I've never really dressed for the sake of general appeal. I never saw the point in it, and I still don't. I mean, my mum can definitely attest that I didn't give the slightest fuck how I looked in childhood. I thought it was the least relevant thing that one could possibly conceptualize. And I still carry that thought with me, although now with an understanding of appearance being a good form of, you know, self-identity, presenting myself in a certain way. And it's interesting, because I think many people use how they dress as a vehicle of self-expression, as opposed to a vehicle of generally trying to appeal to the largest number of people possible. But whenever people are talking about how someone else looks, or are giving feedback on different forms of presentation, it's always filtered through this lens of what looks, generally speaking, good, as opposed to through this lens of self-identity. Which is weird, right? I mean, everyone views how they dress as a form of self-expression, but how other people dress, that's viewed as a means of just looking good? It's a strange dichotomy that doesn't make a huge amount of sense. I mean, I sometimes take hints from Gothic and punk styles in my presentation, or I'll wear clothing that codes me as feminine or as androgynous or what have you. Maybe I'll shave my legs. And it's never been about what looks best, because those beauty standards are defined by a particular culture and a particular conception of beauty. I refuse to define myself in terms of those standards, particularly because I have a lot of ethical concerns with the way that we have arrived at the current conception about beauty standards. To those of you who are not familiar, maybe, with these beauty standards, one only needs to look to things like the fetishization of Asian women and black men and youthfulness in women to see how the legacy of colonialism really does live on within our beauty standards. And I hear a lot of talk about that. I hear a lot of talk about how our beauty standards are not exactly bastions of objectivity, which is good. But I think a similar lens can be applied to the appropriation and the commercialization of culture within those very same beauty standards. Graeber stated that the historic way that slavery was justified was through stripping people of their context. He posited that the way that people's humanity was affirmed and contextualized was through a complex web of social and human connections. He also posited that through stripping people of this web of connections, this was how slavers were able to divorce people from their humanity and their human connections, and thus these slaves could start to be viewed as mere repositories of value ripe to be exploited. Just as I drew an earlier parallel between colonialism and capitalism, I would extend a similar comparison here. Ripping these cultures and subcultures from their context, depriving them of all of their cultural subtext, and divorcing them from their role in affirming the values of a group of people, they start to be viewed as less personal. These fundamentally social phenomena start to feel as impersonal as any other commodity, and then they are safe to be exploited. So, why do I take inspiration from goth and punk in my style of dress? Well, it's because I think those movements are really cool, and because I think that they had some really good values, back when they were allowed to have any.